I'd read about the Hoia Baciu forest before I ever set foot in Romania. People called it the Bermuda Triangle of Transylvania, trees that grew in unnatural shapes, lights that danced without a source, and a perfect circle where nothing ever grew. Most stories I'd heard were secondhand. I wanted something firsthand. So one overcast afternoon in late September, I hired a local guide named Andre. He was quiet, but clearly skeptical. "They exaggerate," he said, leading me past the warped trunks. "Tourists like scary stories." But about 40 minutes in, the air changed. I don't mean the way a breeze picks up, I mean the whole atmosphere shifted. My chest tightened and every inhale felt like I was breathing through wet cloth. "Here." Andre stopped, gesturing at a clearing. It was the famous dead zone, a near-perfect circle where the grass was patchy and nothing taller than a weed grew. I expected it to feel strange, but instead it was silent. So silent I could hear my pulse in my ears. And then, faintly, under that silence, whispering. I froze. It was coming from somewhere past the tree line, hushed and fast, in a language I didn't recognize. It sounded urgent, like someone giving instructions. "You hear that?" I asked. Andre frowned. "Hear what?" I stepped toward the sound, holding up my phone to record. The screen flickered, then went black, though the battery had been at 78%. The whispers stopped. We stood there, both listening. And then, clearer this time, one word in English. "Stay." I spun around, expecting to see someone. No one was there. The wind picked up suddenly, shaking the branches so hard it sounded like rain, but the sky hadn't changed and the leaves didn't fall. "I think we should go," Andre said, his voice tight now. We took the long path back. The forest seemed different. Trees we'd passed before were now angled like they'd been pulled from the soil and replanted at odd tilts. At one point, I looked behind us and saw a man standing between two trees. He was too far to see clearly, but his face seemed wrong, like a smear on wet paint. "Andre?" I started, but when I looked back, the man was gone. We reached the trailhead, and I exhaled for the first time in what felt like hours. The oppressive feeling lifted, replaced by the smell of damp earth and pine. Back at my hotel, I plugged in my phone. The screen lit up as if nothing had happened. My heart jumped when I saw a new photo in my gallery. It wasn't one I'd taken. The image showed the dead zone. Andre and I were standing in the center, looking toward the trees. But between us, leaning slightly forward, was a pale face, eyes too wide, mouth stretched like it was caught mid-word. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I tried to show the photo to Andre, but when I scrolled to it, the image was gone, just an empty space in the gallery. 2 days later, on my last night in Cluj, I woke to the same whispering I'd heard in the forest, urgent, fast, unintelligible. My phone lit up on the nightstand, the flashlight blinking like a signal. I picked it up with shaking hands. One new photo. It was the same dead zone image, but now, the pale face was alone in the clearing, staring straight at the camera.
I was 16 the first time I visited the Smurl house. My parents were friends with Jack and Janet, and they'd invited us over for Sunday dinner. West Pittston was a quiet town, the kind where neighbors still waved at each other, but the Smurl's place sat oddly apart, half in shadow even when the sun was bright. The first thing I noticed when we walked in wasn't the smell of cooking. It was something else, a foul, sour odor, like rotting meat and damp basement walls. Janet apologized, saying it was the plumbing acting up again, but when I passed the bathroom later, I noticed the air was perfectly fresh there. Dinner went fine until the thud. It came from upstairs, heavy enough to rattle the glasses. Jack went to check, but returned pale, saying nothing was out of place. We all tried to laugh it off. Still, when we left that night, I caught my dad glancing at the house in the rearview mirror like it might follow us. Over the next year, my parents heard more from the Smurls. The noises escalated, scraping along the walls, footsteps when no one was upstairs. Janet claimed furniture shifted on its own. Once, she said, a bureau slid across the floor in full view of the children. Jack swore their dog had been lifted and thrown against the wall so hard it yelped for days. By the summer of '86, I was old enough to drive and often stopped by to help Jack with repairs. I never told him how uneasy the house made me. It wasn't just the cold spots in the hallway or the sudden drop in light when it clouds passed. It was the way the silence pressed in between noises, like the house was waiting. One evening, as I helped him replace a kitchen cabinet hinge, a dark shadow swept across the wall. At first, I thought a car had passed outside, but there were no headlights, and the window faced the backyard. Jack froze, his knuckles white around the screwdriver. Then, from the corner of the room came a low growl. It was deep, wrong, vibrating in my bones. We bolted for the porch, both too shaken to say much. The Warrens, the same investigators who'd worked on the Amityville case, came that fall. Neighbors gathered to watch them unload equipment, whispering about what might live inside that house. I wasn't there for the first night, but Jack later told me the smell hit them immediately, followed by a crash upstairs. Lorraine reportedly said there was a non-human entity in the home, something feeding off fear. Their visits didn't fix things. If anything, the activity got worse. Janet began hearing voices at night, whispers in a language she didn't understand. Their daughters would wake up to pounding on the walls, only for the sound to stop the moment someone entered the room. One night, Jack claimed he felt hands grab him and drag him halfway out of bed before letting go. The breaking point came in early '87. I remember the phone call. Janet sobbing, saying she couldn't take another night. The smell was constant, and the walls themselves seemed to shake. They reached out to a local pastor who agreed to perform a blessing. I was there that day. The pastor moved from room to room, sprinkling holy water, murmuring prayers. At first, nothing happened. Then, from the basement came a deafening crash, like a shelf toppling. The air turned icy, our breath visible, and the stench, thicker than ever, rose from the floorboards. I'll never forget the look in the pastor's eyes. It was the first time I'd seen a man of faith look afraid. After hours of prayer, the house fell silent. The smell faded, and the air warmed. The Smurl swore it was over. But a week later, Janet told my mother she still heard faint scratching behind the walls at night. They eventually moved away, leaving the house to someone new. I've driven past it since. Fresh paint, tidy yard, kids' bikes in the driveway. Still, when I stop at the light across the street, I swear I see the curtains shift upstairs, just a little, like something inside is still watching.
I never believed in ghosts, at least not until the night I stayed in the Moore house. I'd been fascinated by the Villisca Axe murder since high school. 8 people, including 6 children, hacked to death in their beds in 1912. The killer was never caught. Some locals say it was the Reverend George Kelly who claimed a voice told him to do it. Others think it was someone who vanished into the cornfields that night. The house is a tourist attraction now, offering overnight stays for anyone brave or foolish enough. I booked my spot months in advance. When I arrived, the late autumn air was sharp, and the sky was already fading into gray. The old white farmhouse sat quietly at the end of a narrow gravel drive, looking ordinary in the worst possible way. Inside, the air felt heavier, almost humid, despite the cold outside. The tour guide walked us through each room, reciting the crime scene details like scripture. In the upstairs bedroom where the Stillinger sisters slept, she pointed to a small dresser. "The killer covered the mirrors after the murders," she said softly. "Nobody knows why." By 10 p.m., the other guests, 3 college students, had gone silent, each of us sinking into our own nervous thoughts.
The house creaked constantly, and I kept telling myself it was just the wood settling. But the longer I sat in the dim kitchen, the more it felt like the creaks had a rhythm, almost like footsteps pacing above us. Around midnight, I decided to explore the upstairs alone. I told myself it was for the experience, but deep down, I think I wanted to prove nothing was there. I climbed the stairs slowly, my flashlight beam trembling against the peeling wallpaper. The moment I reached the top, the air turned ice cold. In the children's room, I stood in the spot where the killer had once stood, axe in hand. The silence pressed against my eardrums until I realized it wasn't silence at all. There was a faint whispering, like someone speaking from inside the walls. I froze, straining to hear. The words were impossible to make out, but the tone, it was pleading. I backed toward the hall, and that's when I saw it. A shadow stretching across the floorboards, long and thin, though there was no one there to cast it. My flashlight flickered, and the whispering grew louder, faster, desperate. Then, a man's voice, clear as if he were standing right behind me, said, "Do you hear him?" I bolted down the stairs, heart hammering. The others looked up from the kitchen table, their faces pale. One of the students whispered, "You heard it too?" Without another word, we all gathered our things and waited outside in the cold until dawn. The staff didn't seem surprised when we told them. "Some nights, he's louder," the guide said, almost casually. I left Villisca that morning and never went back. But sometimes, late at night, I wake up certain I can hear that same whisper, soft, urgent, bleeding through my bedroom walls. And if I listen too long, I start to make out the words.
Waverly Hills Sanatorium, perched on a remote hill in Kentucky, has a reputation that sends chills even through the bravest. Once a tuberculosis hospital during the early 20th century, it was a place of suffering and death for thousands. But what unsettles visitors most today isn't the crumbling walls or the stale, cold air. It's the presence they say still lingers, the Weeping Lady. My connection to Waverly Hills came unexpectedly. A few years ago, I volunteered to help document paranormal activity there, part of a small investigative team curious about the stories. We'd heard the rumors, the mournful cries echoing down the long, empty halls, the sudden cold spots, the fleeting glimpses of a woman's figure cloaked in mist. But nothing prepared me for what I experienced on my first night inside. It started around midnight. The sanatorium was deathly silent except for the faint hum of our equipment. As we moved down one of the long corridors, I caught it. A soft, heart-wrenching sob. It was distant at first, barely audible, like a whisper carried on the wind. I froze. Everyone else said they heard nothing. I told myself it was the wind, a trick of the old building settling. But then the sobbing grew louder. It wasn't just sorrow, it was desperation, raw and unbearable. I turned a corner and stopped dead in my tracks. There, at the end of the hall, stood a figure, faint, translucent, draped in a nurse's uniform. Her head was bowed, hair loose and damp, and I could see tears glistening on her cheeks. I blinked, and she vanished. The next day, my teammates laughed it off, chalking it up to exhaustion or imagination. But that night, we reviewed the footage from our infrared cameras. On the video, there was no doubt a misty figure appeared briefly in the hallway, the outline of a woman sobbing, her form dissolving into nothing. Later research revealed her name, Mary Lee, a nurse who worked tirelessly during the sanatorium's darkest days. According to local legend, Mary contracted tuberculosis herself while caring for patients. Overwhelmed by the pain and isolation, she died tragically, young, alone, in those very halls. Visitors have reported hearing her cries for decades, long after the sanatorium closed its doors.
Some say her spirit wanders the corridors, mourning the lives lost and the loneliness she endured. Others believe she tries to comfort the suffering souls trapped there. The strangest part is how personal the presence feels. It's not the typical cold, hostile ghost story. Mary's sorrow is palpable, almost human. The sobs seem to reach inside you, dragging your own heart into that vast emptiness she must have felt. One night, as I left the building, I turned back once more. From a window on the second floor, a shadowy figure watched silently. It was her, the weeping lady, waiting as if she had unfinished business. That was the last time I went inside Waverly Hills. Even now, years later, I sometimes hear that sobbing in my mind. It's a reminder that some hauntings aren't about vengeance or anger. They're about grief, so deep that it refuses to fade. Mary Lee's tears still fall, somewhere between this world and the next, in the silent halls of Waverly Hills Sanatorium.
I've never spoken about what I saw in that room. I was 19 in the spring of 1976, a theology student in Würzburg, Germany. The parish priest, Father Alt, had asked me to assist with spiritual observation during a series of exorcisms on a young woman named Anneliese Michel. When I first met her, I expected to see someone unhinged from superstition. Instead, she looked like any exhausted university student, thin, pale, with hair pulled back into a messy braid. But her eyes, they seemed to dart toward corners no one else noticed, tracking something that wasn't there. Her parents believed she was possessed. So did she. And after that first night, I began to believe it too. The room smelled like metal and damp earth, though there was nothing in it but a bed, a chair, and the crucifix nailed to the wall. She was already restrained, not for violence toward others, but because she had started injuring herself between sessions, biting her arms, scratching at her own skin. The rite began in Latin, Father Alt reading from the Rituale Romanum. At first, Anneliese simply stared at the floor, lips moving silently, as if mocking his words. But when he reached Exorcizote immundissime spiritus, her head snapped up, and her voice, low, guttural, far too deep for her frame, spoke a string of curses in a dialect I didn't recognize. The air felt heavier. I'd read about mass hysteria in psychology, but this wasn't hysteria. The temperature dropped so suddenly my breath clouded in front of me. Over the next months, I returned for dozens of sessions. Some lasted hours. She would switch between personalities, sometimes a weeping young woman, sometimes claiming to be Judas, Nero, or Lucifer himself. Once, she recited an entire psalm backwards without pause. But it wasn't only her behavior that unnerved me. Things happened in that room no one could explain. The wooden chair in the corner once tipped over without anyone touching it. The crucifix above the bed darkened, as if scorched, though no flame had been near it. By the autumn, she was wasting away. She refused food, claiming it tasted of rot. Her lips split from dehydration, yet she wouldn't drink water, saying it was stolen from the river of the damned. The priests kept going, convinced that stopping would leave her soul to the demons. One night in early June 1976, I was called for what would be the last session. When I entered, she was lying on the floor, unrestrained, her breathing shallow and irregular. Her skin had a bluish tint. Father Renz was there too, holding the crucifix over her chest, his voice hoarse from chanting. I knelt beside her. "Anneliese," I whispered, "do you want me to get a doctor?" Her eyes fluttered open. For the first time in months, they were calm. No flicker of rage, no twitch toward unseen shapes. She smiled faintly. "It's done," she said, her voice soft and human. Then she turned her head toward the corner of the room, as if listening. A tear slid down her cheek.
She mouthed something I couldn't hear and went still. She died the next morning. The cause was listed as starvation and dehydration. Her parents and the priests were prosecuted for negligent homicide. I was never called to testify. But I can still smell that metallic air when I think of her. I can still see the moment her face changed, like something had finally let go. And sometimes, late at night, I hear that same soft voice in my head. It's done. Only, I don't think it was.